HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Grub-and-Stakers Quilt a Bee by Charlotte Macleod. Read by Lory Reyes.
Chapter 1. "Will fry me for a donut," cried Hazel Munson. Therese Boulanger wanged her gavel. "May we have that in the form of a motion?" Therese was a stickler for protocol. "Stuff it, Therese," muttered Dittany Henbit monk, who was not. Her utterance was drowned in cries of, "I don't believe it, my stars and garters," and similar outbursts, including a "Gadzooks" from Arethusa Monk, the famous author of roguish Regency romances. How could their president drag in Robert's Rules of Order at a time like this? Never before in all its long and checkered history had the Grub-and-Stake Gardening and Roving Club of Lobelia Falls, Ontario, received a bequest of any magnitude at all, much less a whole dad-blanged museum. The dad-blanged was contributed by the aforementioned Dittany Henbit monk. Her vocabulary had taken strange new directions as a result of her recent marriage to Osbert Monk, better known to the sagebrush intelligentsia as Lex Laramie. Osbert would be back at the house on Applewood Avenue right now, throwing his literary lasso over the neck of some dreamed-up maverick and wondering if he'd meant to write Dogie instead. Did he but know? Dittany could hardly wait to tell him. She'd jolly well have to wait, though. Therese was no slouch with a gavel. The meeting was back to order. "For the benefit of those who may not have grasped the details of the matter before us," Therese meant everybody who'd been too busy gabbling to pay attention, but was too good a parliamentarian to say so. "I shall read the terms of the bequest again. The subject will then be thrown open for discussion. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized by the chair. Otherwise," she added, for Therese was human too, "we'll be here all night." "Read on, Macduff," boomed Arethusa. Therese cleared her throat. "Under the terms of the holograph will that was found in the files down at the Water Department after we'd all assumed Jean Architrave had died intestate, his house on Victoria Street, which we all know to be a fine, though sadly run-down example of early Lobelia Falls architecture, of which we have far too little left, thanks to what some people choose to call progress." "Is that all in the will, for Pete's sake?" Hazel Munson whispered to Dittany. "Shh!" The shush was Samantha Burberry's. Being an elected town official and chairman of the club's legislative committee, she felt duty-bound to uphold the torch of parliamentarianism. Therese got herself back in hand. "The gist of it is, Jean has left his house to the club free and clear, on conditions that we maintain and operate it as a museum dedicated to the memory of Jean's wife, a former president and four-time winner of the Winona Picture Award, and that the museum be in fact known and designated by an appropriate sign or plaque as the Aurelia Polyphema Architrave Museum. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to ask our legislative chairman whether there is anything in the bylaws that might preclude our accepting such a bequest." Samantha rose, poised and elegant as always. "Nothing whatever to my knowledge. It would appear to fit nicely under Section A, Clause 3, which states that the club shall initiate and carry out projects for the general education and beautification of our community." "Thank you, Samantha. Any objections?" Hazel Munson's hand shot up. "I'm not objecting. I'd just like to know if that old meathead left us any funds to run the place with." For one long, horrified moment, there was not a whisper in the room. Everyone knew John had left his life savings to his one surviving relative, their own beloved Minerva Oakes, co-chairman of the Landscape Committee. They also knew how desperately Minerva needed the cash, and they'd rejoiced over the elderly widow's great windfall. Hazel, realizing too late what a brick she'd dropped, clapped her hand over her errant mouth. Minerva looked stricken but rose gamely. "I'm quite willing to—" "Shut up!" barked Zilla Trott, the other half of the Landscape Committee. "You're out of order. Madam Chairman," she waved her hand wildly,
I make a formal motion that the club refuse to accept one plugged nickel from Minerva Oaks."
"Second the motion," cried the members as one voice. Even Therese seconded before she remembered she wasn't supposed to, then called for a vote before Minerva could get another word in. The ayes had it so loudly the windows bulged. "Now," said Zillah, "I move the chair appoint a Ways and Means Committee." "Objection!" cried Arethusa. "First we elect a board of trustees, then they appoint their own committee." "That's right," Therese agreed, clearly nonplussed to find Arethusa in possession of so mundane a fact. "Then I nominate Arethusa chairman of the board of trustees," Zillah amended, nothing daunted. It took a lot to daunt Zillah. Again there was a free-for-all to second the nomination. Arethusa was not only the club's celebrity, but the member with the most spare cash. Furthermore, she had Dittany to keep her in hand. While still a henbit, Dittany had been Arethusa's typing service and voice of reason. As a niece-in-law, she packed even more clout. Hence, Dittany got nominated forthwith as secretary. Therese would be a member ex officio. Dot Koskoff would be treasurer because she could both add and subtract. Hazel Munson had to be on the board because she could keep her head when all about her were losing theirs and blaming it on anybody who came handy. Minerva was named vice president as a matter of courtesy and a way of salving her conscience anent the money by giving her a reason to work her head off for the museum, which she'd have done anyway. Zillah Trott came next because nobody could envision a committee that Minerva was on and Zillah wasn't. Mrs. McVicker then moved the nominations be closed because 6 trustees were plenty. Nobody cared to contradict Mrs. McVicker, whose husband was the law in Lobelia Falls, so they elected the board and broke up the meeting. Instead of staying to participate in the wild babble that followed, Dittany sped home to her husband. "Osbert, listen." "Eh?" Osbert dragged his attention away from some distant arroyo or mesa and focused it on his wife. "Darling, it's you." "And whom were you expecting?" "Well, you see, Harold the headless horse thief was galloping into the haunted canyon, and for just a second there I wondered if we mightn't have some of those big molasses cookies with the crinkly edges hanging around anywhere handy." "Let's go look," said Dittany, for she loved Osbert dearly. They went, Osbert nuzzling gently at the back of his bride's neck, as the faithful Appaloosa of his hero was wont to do. To the hero's neck, of course. Dittany's was a neck just right for nuzzling, whereas the cowboys must perforce be tanned to leather and perhaps not very recently washed. Osbert was feeling pleasantly one-up on the Appaloosa as he buckled down to his tea and cookies. The mood was dispelled by his Aunt Arethusa's barging through the back door in full cry, as was her lamentable habit. "Osbert, go away," was her greeting. "We have to hold a trustees' meeting." "Stuff it, Arethusa," said Dittany, Osbert's mouth being full of cookie at the moment. "A man is king in his own castle." "What castle, prithee? This house is yours, not his." It was, in fact, the ancestral residence of the Henbits, but Dittany refused to yield her point. "It's ours. Osbert spent more getting the place glued back together than it was worth before he started. Sit down and have a cookie. We can't hold a meeting without the rest of the trustees." "Why not, egad? We haven't drawn up any bylaws yet, so how can we be in violation of them?" "I'd have to clear that point with Therese. Anyway, I don't want to hold a trustees' meeting. I want to—" "I know what you want to, and I think it's perfectly disgusting. Can't you wait till bedtime, forsooth?" "Arethusa, that was not what I meant," said Dittany with quiet dignity. "Why not? Aha! A riff to the lute. What's that beastly nephew of mine been up to now?" "Osbert is not beastly. Osbert is a lammy pie with fur-lined booties on. What I intended to say was that I want to start supper because we horsed around at the meeting this afternoon far too long, and I'm practicing to be a perfect wife." "Darling, you already are," cried Osbert, having coped with the cookie. "I haven't ironed your shirts yet." "A bagatelle." I'll wear this same one tomorrow." "You will not. What would the neighbors think?" "Figo for the neighbors," said Arethusa. "Could we get on with the meeting? The gist or nub of the matter is that we've got to appoint a curator forthwith." "Why forthwith?" said Dittany. "Because I've already been approached by 17 people who want to donate priceless artifacts to the museum. That's why." "What priceless artifacts?" "A hand-embroidered corset cover worn by Samantha Burberry's husband's great-grandmother on the occasion of her presentation to Queen Victoria at the Court of St. James. A set of hand-carved false teeth once owned by a certain Sam Small, the first wagon driver who came to Lobelia Falls, later hanged for cattle rustling in Alberta." Osbert brightened. "Now there's an item of genuine historical interest." "To whom, prithee? If you think I'm going to accept any bogus bicuspids in my capacity as chairman of the board of trustees of the whatever her name was museum, you can think again, eh? The trouble is, I can't come straight out and say so, because Zilla Trot's the one who wants to donate the teeth." "I see," said Dittany. "I don't," said Osbert. "You wouldn't," snarled Arethusa. "It's quite simple, darling," Dittany explained. "We need somebody who can winnow out the junk from the good stuff without making everybody hate him." "Him?" "Or her. I use the pronoun abstractedly. You remember about abstract pronouns, dear?" "Certainly I remember about abstract pronouns. Aunt Arethusa wouldn't know an abstract pronoun if it walked up and tipped its hat to her." "I would so," said Arethusa. "You would not. You only know words like stap my garters." "Garters? Egad, yes. A pair of red silk arm garters won by old Mr. Bush in a poker game when he was a telegraph operator up in Yellowknife in 1909. You see what we're up against?" Dittany nodded gloomily. By nightfall, they'd have been offered a wealth of hand-crocheted chamber pot covers, second-hand beehives, wooden legs, Moody and Sankey hymnals, autographed photos of Ivor Novello, moth-eaten army uniforms, and that umbrella stand made from interwoven buffalo horns Dot Koskoff's mother had been trying to unload on somebody for the past 43 years. Would anybody in town have the guts to explain that none of these things was precisely what the Aurelia Polyphema Architrave Museum happened to be in urgent need of at the moment? Sighing, she reached for the telephone. "Whom are you calling, forsooth?" Arethusa demanded. "Hazel, Dot, Minerva, and Zilla, of course. Much as I hate to admit it, Arethusa, you're right." Chapter 2. Many years had passed since Aurelia Polyphema laid down her bow and gavel for the last time. After her death, John Architrave had lived alone. He'd managed his housekeeping much as he'd managed the water department, and that was as ill as anybody in Lobelia Falls cared to speak of the dead. Before they could start putting things into the museum, an awful lot would have to be taken out. Osbert donated part of the advance on his latest Western, whose heroine had blue-green eyes, blondish-brown hair with highlights the color of dawn on the mesa, and cheeks like the bloom of the yucca or Spanish bayonet, and happened, by apt coincidence, to be named Dittany. That paid for the hiring of a dump truck to cart away enough trash so that the peeling wallpaper and cobwebbed ceilings could be got at. Before restoration could begin, though, the problem of what to restore it to had to be resolved. After considerable wrangling, the trustees decided to do what everybody then claimed to have been in favor of all along, namely, to plan the museum as a typical Canadian home of the early Lobelia Falls period. Only genuine antiques or accurate reproductions would be used, and decisions of the curator would be final. The curator would be kept firmly in-thumbed by the trustees, but the general public wasn't to know that. By this stratagem or ruse, they hoped to keep out the carved coconuts and Art Deco smoking stands without antagonizing friends and neighbors who'd been kidding themselves that they'd at last found a place to park the family relics without upsetting the in-laws. Finding a curator turned out to be a piece of cake. Dot Koskoff's sister's brother-in-law had an uncle who had a cousin who'd just been retired as assistant curator from a museum down in Boston or Chicago or some other benighted outpost of civilization. He wasn't finding retirement to his liking. Since he was already collecting a pension, he'd be willing to accept the meager stipend they could afford, provided the architrave, that was the first time they'd heard it called that, threw in living quarters for himself and his wife. That was no problem either. Old John, in his infinite chuckle-headedness, had installed the one bathroom in a former woodshed off the back entry, as far away as possible from the upstairs bedrooms. Some said it was this inconvenience that had vexed the late Aurelia into an early grave, but now John's thoughtlessness worked to the museum's advantage. The bathroom could stay where it was, the big old kitchen be turned into a sitting room, the pantry into a kitchenette, and what had been called the birthing room become a smallish but adequate bedroom. It was doubtful if a pair of retirees would be doing much birthing. Mr. and Mrs. Fairfield, such being their name, appeared charmed by these plans and set to move in right away, but of course they'd have to wait until the transformation was accomplished. Meanwhile, Minerva Oaks offered them free room and board. Before coming into John's money, Minerva had eked out her widow's mite by taking in boarders, most of them spectacular duds. Undaunted by disastrous experience, she remained a hospitable soul, didn't mind strangers at her breakfast table, and was still having qualms about her inheritance. Hence nobody tried to talk her out of having the Fairfields, and thus it came to pass. Once they'd got to meet the newcomers, the trustees saw why Mr. Fairfield had remained an assistant all those years in his old job. He couldn't have given orders to the museum cat, let alone the staff. Nevertheless, he seemed to know his artifacts and to have sound, though diffidently expressed, ideas about what the architrave ought and ought not to contain. Mrs. Fairfield was a different matter. Hazel Munson summed up the consensus best. "You sure can tell which of that pair never has to starch her undershirts." The new curator's wife was pleasant-spoken enough, but she did show an awful lot of gum when she smiled. She wasn't lazy, though. Despite a broken wrist, sustained, she told them, on moving day by falling over a box, she insisted on pitching right in with the cleanup crew. Lobelia Falls folk were born pitchers in, by and large. If you wanted the ghastly old wallpaper stripped, for instance, you had but to drop a hint to Mr. Peavy at the hardware store. Before you could turn around, he'd be on deck with his wallpaper steamer, his 4 stalwart sons, and their 4 stalwart girlfriends. If you wanted spiderwebs swept down, you could summon whole platoons of broom-wielders who gave neither jot nor tittle for the most fearsome arachnid ever hatched. At least never hatched in Lobelia Falls, where spiders aren't usually very fearsome anyway. If you had mice to be caught, and you did because old John had been an awful slob, you called in a few of the neighborhood cats. Even Andrew McNaster, who owned the local construction company as well as the inn next door to the architrave, sent a couple of busboys over one hot afternoon to help with the cleaning up. Everybody's natural reaction was, "What's he up to this time?" "He figures we're all dying of thirst over here from the dust," was Dittany's theory. "He's trying to get us to quit boycotting his lousy den of iniquity and start dropping over for cold beers. Then he'll get us drunk and pull another of his cute tricks." "Such as what?" Hazel Munson asked, wiping a cobweb off her nose. "I don't know, but don't try to tell me he's doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He hasn't got one. You know, McNaster was hoping to get his mitts on this property so he could turn John's house into a disco bar. We'd better search the place for incendiary devices after those kids leave." They duly searched, but found no sign of malfeasance. As the days wore on and McNaster workmen kept showing up with offers of free carpentry, free electrical wiring, free washers for the dripping faucets in the Fairfields' new kitchenette, and a free plumber to put them in, their wonder grew. "Can you beat that, eh?" Hazel marveled. "He's either got religion or gone soft in the head." "In a pig's eye he has," Dittany insisted. "He's up to something, you mark my words." "Oh, Dittany, don't be paranoid," said Dot Koskoff. Those workmen are on McMaster's regular payroll. If he doesn't happen to have a full day's work for them, he packs them over to us so he can build up a reputation for philanthropy at no extra cost to himself. I wonder if we might finagle a few more feet of free shelving out of him before he gets tired of being Mr. Nice Guy." Dittany scowled. "Don't we have enough money to buy the lumber ourselves?" "Yes, but why should we if we can get it for nothing? We've got to think of the future, you know." So they did. Thus far, the trustees hadn't been plagued by fiscal woes, thanks to Osbert's handsome donation and Arethusa's determination not to let a mere nephew head her off at the pass. Still, there was a long, cold winter coming. Therese Boulanger talked of bake sales, but it would take an awful lot of brandy snaps to keep the boiler running. Dot Koskoff came up with the truly brilliant plan of accepting everything everybody was hell-bent on donating, with the proviso that whatever proved inappropriate for exhibition could be peddled at an ongoing flea market or marché aux puces. Donors' names would, she stipulated, go down regardless in the handsome book provided for that purpose by Mr. Gumpert of Ye Village Stationer. Being a donor wouldn't exempt anyone from having to pay membership fees, but it would keep the egos buttered. That was all very well, but, as Zilla Trott pointed out, they weren't going to get rich in a hurry peddling second-hand arm garters and cracked shaving mugs, nor were people going to flock to join the museum until they had something tangible to flock to. Be that as it might, things were moving along well enough at the moment. Mr. Fairfield was finding a reasonable amount of wheat among the chaff. Mrs. Fairfield was cleaning and refurbishing what he found. By the 1st of August, the front parlor was actually painted, papered, and ready to go on view. To be sure, they'd zeroed in on the front parlor first because it was the easiest. No architrave had ever been known to enter the room except for weddings, funerals, tea with the minister, or ritual cleaning back in the days when there was still a housewife to clean it. The furniture of the carved grapes and horsehair period was mostly salvageable. There was a square rosewood piano whose ivories required only to be glued back on and whose finish responded nicely to lemon oil and elbow grease. It wouldn't play anything except a thunk, but it did look elegant under a gorgeously shirred and tasseled silk piano scarf Samantha Burberry's mother-in-law donated. As to ornaments for the whatnot and mantelpiece, Mr. Fairfield had but to choose among a plethora of hair wreaths, wax fruit, souvenirs from Lake Louise, and bone china mustache cups. The rest of the house hadn't been such a happy hunting ground. Once the place had been built and furnished, succeeding generations of architraves had made do with what was already there. As tables and chairs wore out or collapsed, they'd been thrown down cellar or up attic and left to molder away. Thanks to Osbert's dump truck, the cellar had now been cleaned out and was temporarily being used to hold the overflow of donations for Dot Koskoff's flea market. Even the most zealous among the cleanup crew shied away from tackling the attic, though, until one day when Osbert Monk was off in Toronto seeing his publishers, and Dittany was feeling specially bereft. To take her mind off the pain of separation, she wandered up and began poking around. Less than 3 minutes later, Mrs. Fairfield joined her. "Found anything interesting, Mrs. Monk?" Dittany would have preferred to be alone in her bereavement, but good breeding prevailed. "I just got here," she answered. "Horrible, isn't it? I'm going to fight my way over to a window and see if I can't get a breath of fresh air in here." "That would be a great help. Do you think you could?" There were few things Dittany wasn't willing to have a shot at, especially with Mrs. Fairfield standing there flashing those shiny pink gums in challenge. She squirmed a path through the debris and managed, after several attempts, to wrestle open a window that had perhaps never been opened before. The window promptly fell shut again because the cords had either rotted out or never been put in, so she reopened it and propped up the sash with a bit of wreckage that lay close to hand. The window was not very big, hardly more than dollhouse size, and recessed into the mansard roof to render it even less efficient at catching what breeze there was, but it did help a little. After a few refreshing whiffs and a brief rest, Dittany managed to reach and open a couple more. Gradually the air became almost breathable. Sneezing a good deal, for the dust lay half an inch thick everywhere, she and Mrs. Fairfield got down to business. Moths and mice, allowed to chew unchecked for half a century or so, can do a remarkable lot of damage. Most of the articles touched by the searchers crumbled to bits in their hands. Dittany did find a wrought iron trivet no predator had found palatable, and Mrs. Fairfield unearthed a flowered slop jar with only a minor crack in it. Spurred on by these small triumphs, they persisted. There is a fascination about hunting for hidden treasure, even in places like John Architrave's attic. Dittany got filthy and sweaty and knew she was doing dreadful things to the hands Osbert loved to touch. Nevertheless, she kept going. Mrs. Fairfield put up a valiant effort, but she really couldn't do much with that cast on her wrist. It was Dittany who forged ahead to where the dust lay thickest. Dittany who found the trunk full of old clothes. Dittany who almost had a heart attack when 16 mice jumped out at her from among the shreds. And ultimately Dittany who came upon a package wrapped in brown paper tucked between the remains of a redingote and a corset cover. "That trunk might do for one of the bedrooms," Mrs. Fairfield was musing when Dittany hauled out her find. "The clothes are hopeless, I'm afraid, but what have you there, Mrs. Monk?" "I don't know. I'm scared to open it." Mrs. Fairfield took the package out of Dittany's hands. "It doesn't look as if it's been gnawed. Feels like a box of some sort. Perhaps it's photographs or letters. Mr. Fairfield always gets excited over letters." Very carefully, Mrs. Fairfield eased off the wrapping without tearing the paper or breaking the string. That was important, it seemed, although Dittany couldn't imagine why. She was rooting for a Bible or a family album herself, for the perverse reason that she didn't want Mrs. Fairfield to have guessed right about the box. A box, however, it was, and not just any box, but a well-made little walnut chest with a neat hook-and-eye fastening. Mrs. Fairfield slipped the hook and opened the lid. The box was full of silk and satin scraps. "Why, it's a bride's quilt," she exclaimed, "or rather the pieces for one. You've never heard of those, I don't suppose." At least Dittany got to contradict her. "As a matter of fact, I have my own great-grandmother's at home. She got it for a wedding present. All her girlfriends took pieces of their best Sunday-go-to-meeting gowns and embroidered pretty little doodads and whatnots on them. Then they featherboned them together into a crazy quilt for the nuptial couch." The nuptial couch rather slipped out. Perhaps she'd typed one too many of Arethusa's roguish Regency romances before Osbert lured her off to the wide-open spaces where men were men and didn't go around stapping their garters. It didn't matter, though, because Mrs. Fairfield wasn't paying attention. She was turning over the charmingly embroidered patches, rubbing the satins and velvets between her fingers. "I wonder why the quilt never got put together. Perhaps the bride-to-be died. No, it was more likely the groom. That's why she'd have treasured the pieces even though it had become pointless to complete the quilt. We'll have to do some research on who she might have been. What a pity the quilt never got finished. I can't think how we're going to exhibit all those loose scraps, but it would be a dreadful pity not to." "Then we'll hold a quilting bee," said Dittany. "That will attract more people to the museum and we'll hit 'em up for donations. While we're about it, we can make up a modern copy of this one and raffle it off." "But, Mrs. Monk, that's an extremely ambitious project. It would require a crew of expert needlewomen." Dittany opened wide the eyes which Osbert had compared favorably to the azure-tinted skies which o'erspread the western deserts when gentle rains of spring awake the cactus buds to bloom. After the rains had done their thing, he'd meant, and gone away and let the sun come out, but that had been on their honeymoon, when he'd been filled with too great a euphoria to boggle at meteorological detail. Nor had Dittany been in any mood to carp. Right now her mood was less yielding. "Mrs. Fairfield, there isn't a woman in Lobelia Falls who can't embroider. Minerva Oaks featherbones like a house afire. My mother does, too, when she puts her mind to it. She's at an optical convention with my stepfather just now, but they may stop over for a while on their way back to Vancouver. Then again," for Dittany knew the nomadic habits of Mum and Bert, "they may not. But anyway, I'm sure we can manage a quilting bee. We even have a bee to quilt. Look." She pointed a grubby index finger at one of the scraps Mrs. Fairfield was still fingering. 2 bees, in fact, There's another on that piece of blue velvet stuck to the inside of the lid. I wonder why.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?